Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Welcome back, everybody, to Future Hacker. I'm your host, Maria Taiji. Today we're talking to Annabelle Vultee. This is the second episode. We are talking about learning new languages and the advancements in this sector. So, Annabelle, moving on. With the evolution of artificial intelligence and machine learning, do you think we will ever reach a stage in which computers will have fluency in new languages to a point that simultaneous translation will work, for example? As much as currently robots, they fall short at interpreting context. Do you think in the future people will need to be learning a new language at all? Which for me personally, I think it's pretty sad, as learning new languages are a great way to develop the brain and combat diseases like Alzheimer. Also an amazing way to socialize. But still, we are talking about technology here, right? So do you think robots will ever reach that stage? What's your thought about that?
Oh, I get this question a lot. This is, I think, the ever-present $64,000 question for some reason. The short answer is yes. Eventually, I do believe that computers will be able to do translation of languages. We aren't that far from computers being able to translate fairly well in real time. Mobile phones and computers, PCs, various devices can do that pretty well today. But what they do is literal translation of words. But I want to make a point on a few different things. One is that learning a language is not just words. I think that's how people conceive of it in an abstract way. But the reality is language is nuance, it's culture, it's manners, and it's even in deeply embedded values. For example, as Feng Yulan said in his book, A Short History of Chinese Philosophy, Chinese is a suggestive language in which you have to read between the lines for meaning, whereas Germanic and Romance languages, among others, are articulate languages, which are more literal and direct. So an American, like myself, speaking to a Chinese, like I've done many times in the last 8 years, can often be like speaking on two completely different planes, even if both people are speaking the same language, whether it's Chinese or English. How one delivers the words and one receives the words are not always the same. This is a human nuance to language that has evaded AI and machine learning thus far, but when those planes do converge, it's quite magical. So I think that's the part that computers haven't yet mastered. All the nuance and understanding of the differences between the foundation of language is not only words. And I think that's the stumbling block where we are today. In real life, when two people make a connection and they get beyond the words to the nuance and the meaning and reading between the lines, it's really the difference between making a human connection and just having a basic text-based conversation. I think a computer will soon be able to translate what you're saying, but not necessarily what you mean or you want to convey, as I was saying before. It also won't help you gauge whether the recipient's going to be offended or appeased or anything else in the way learning a language from humans can today. So another example in China, which is really, really important in our culture, would be the culture of saving face. So as an American, I'm very direct. I mean, Americans and Dutch people are sort of notorious for being the two most direct people on the planet. So if I translated my words, we shouldn't have done this way, we should do it differently next time, Xiaomin. If I said that in front of a room full of people and colleagues of Xiaomin's, Xiaomin might quit because I made him lose face. These are simple words. This is just saying we should do it differently that next time. To me, that might not be any big deal. But to him, that is completely embarrassing and makes him look like he's failed in front of a room full of people. That's not the kind of thing a computer is going to be able to teach you. It simply isn't. These are not just words. This is sentiment, meaning, and cultural exchange, really. And I've yet to come across a language translation technology that can bridge this big of a transom. But where machine learning already plays a role in language learning, it's also going to help in this sort of learning personalization. And artificial intelligence, we're going to be able to see robot teachers who are going to have a little bit of this ability in them. Absolutely.
That's great. It makes a lot of sense, Annabelle. Thank you. Let's think about a very, very further future. Do you believe there will ever be one language? You know, we all know that there was this tentative a couple of time ago and it didn't work out. Do you believe we're headed this way?
That's a really interesting question. Maybe a few lifetimes from now. In the coming couple hundred years, I would say no, from my perspective. As with the question before, this philosophy and utility of language is so different around the world. So unless China and Japan adopt the Roman alphabet, and there's a common written, even alphabet, not even language, but alphabet, and that the Chinese and Japanese cultures change quite significantly, which I do not see happening anytime soon, I think there's little chance. There's sort of a third of the world that really exists in a bit of a bubble when it comes to dramatically different language and culture nuance. That's not something I see changing in the very near future. Is it possible in 100, 200, 300 years? Yeah. I mean, it's also possible there won't be a planet. So, I mean, anything is possible. I guess it's impossible to try to forecast too far, but not in the near future, in my opinion. But that said, I can imagine a day in less than 100 years where residents of most global urban cities can speak English either as a primary or secondary language. We're really on that trajectory already. The world has adopted, from a business perspective, which will trickle down, English as a common language. And as people will start to see in the coming months, as the vaccine comes prevalent for COVID, globalization didn't die with COVID. People and businesses want to continue to be cross-border. So as these economies and people and cultures continue to commingle, and we all crave at least a practical way to communicate, to keep life moving, it's ever faster pace. I think we're going to continue to have more people learning English, but I don't know if I would see that as the only language on the planet that basically everyone speaks. I think that's still many centuries away.
So Annabelle, per our conversation, I can see there's so many exciting things still to happen when it comes to the language learning sector, right? So we're still going to see maybe robots teaching humans how to speak other languages. But I got a sense that you believe that even if we reach those technologies, I don't think that you see us learning a new language actually dying, right? You think that even by having access to those technologies, people will still try to find its way of learning themselves. Is that correct?
I hope they will. I'm not sure that they will. I think it's a really good question. One thing is whether people want to learn a language to its fluency or close enough to understand the cultural nuances of another language to really engage with another person. But it depends on the purpose of people learning English. So if the purpose of people learning English is to not make the human connection aspect and to not necessarily take into account the cultural nuances to get the most out of a language, but more practical and operational, sending emails, doing very basic business transactions, absolutely, I think it can move much faster. I think it's when you're talking about people actually making the human connections that's involved in learning a language, whether you're dating someone from another country or you're leading a team of people across different borders and trying to actually understand who these people are and what's important to them. That's a totally different level. And that's the part where I think we're really far behind. And I'm not sure there's a clear roadmap to get there. Practical basic translation, no problem. We're there. It's the other piece. That's really hard for us to gauge. And I haven't seen a lot of work done on it either. So I think that's the part where I don't see a clear path forward, but I'm sure it will come. As the world globalizes, I think you can't avoid it, but I don't see it on the immediate horizon.
Yeah, makes sense. So everybody, when I introduced Annabelle, you could notice she's involved in so many other things besides language learning. So I had to change topics during this interview to try to cover some of all the other things that she has expertise, right, Annabelle? So let's move to a different topic that you have a lot of experience as well. You've been working with startups on innovative technologies such as IoT in an advisor role. It would be great if you could share with us your view of the main challenges that startups face when searching for funding, especially when it comes to new technologies that are still finding their ways on the market. We have a lot of listeners that are also entrepreneurs, right? Which would be your advice to the future hackers out there?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think my first piece of advice to the future hackers out there is keep doing what you're doing. You're an inspiration to the world, and we need dreamers. We need people who are willing to put their ideas on the line and make them come to reality. And don't stop, and don't be afraid of rejection. That's my first piece of advice, maybe the most critical one. But from what I've seen from a business perspective advising a few startups over my years is I think the main challenges are twofold. The first one is explaining, if it's a technology, it's explaining the new technology, why it should exist, what the market is, and how the hell it works. When you're coming up with something brand new, getting people who, most of the planet isn't that conceptual or futuristic, like a lot of the people who probably listen to your podcast, who can really imagine something that hasn't yet existed. Entrepreneurs and inventors, that's what they do. Their brains just work in a different way. They can see something we can't necessarily see as normal people. So I think being able to get past what they see in their head and what they might see in a prototype, to be able to explain it and the relevance to the world, I think is one of the biggest challenges for innovators out there. The second one is figuring out when they really need to move from fundraising to revenue driving as a source of growth. Over the last 10 to 15 years, and you see all these Airbnb IPO'd last week, and it had 100% increase in market share and market price, in a single day. People are so excited about all the opportunities that are out there, and so many venture capital and private equity firms are happy to provide money and funding to grow great ideas, especially related to technology, that it's addictive for young innovators or early innovators to get hooked on the drug of funding as opposed to revenue driving. And I think that that's a really risky way to think about a business. One thing is the idea. The second thing is building it or making it come to life. And the third thing is actually providing it in a market space. So unless you're selling to governments or one particular customer in a B2B environment, you really need to start thinking about how will it generate money that actually provides profit, which will provide a going concern longevity to the business in the long term. And I think that that's a really hard thing for innovators to do, because it's easier to get money today than it ever has been. Even if it doesn't seem easy to all of your listeners, not everybody has access to this capital, but a lot of people do. But, if you're facing an issue with getting funding from one of these sources, angel investors, VCPE, banks, find a way to sell whatever it is you're making, and then the money will come much, much easier. So I think that's really critical. So those are sort of the two challenges. And I would say, innovators are really amazing people, but they're not always business drivers. So you really have to be careful about understanding the difference between revenue and funding. So that's one thing I think you should be aware of. And go find a business-oriented partner who can help guide you, make connections for you, and help you get perspective on when is it time for funding versus when is it time for generating revenue from selling your product.
Wow, there's really, really valuable knowledge in there, Annabelle. So basically, knowing how to explain your technology, and then understanding the differences when, funding is needed and when actually generating revenue is needed. But you also mentioned having a business partner which could help you opening the doors and finding the right connections, right? You mentioned that getting funded is not as hard as it was before, but as well, not everybody knows how to get there, how to get to the sources. So maybe that's the part in which the business partner could play, right? Could you share with us, going back to this startup that you're helping, which is working with IoT, Internet of Things, is anything about them that you could share with us? You told me in the story how they started doing one thing and then they completely changed the focus. I think this would be a good case for our listeners, so they can understand how changing fast and, changing the focus rapidly to keep the feedback from the market, hearing the partners is important, hearing what the market needs instead of what was on your mind, and being able to change fast. This is something that I remember we talked about. Could you share something in this direction?
Sure, happy to. So this company called Varm, which is based in China, but run by a Swedish man who I've known for quite a while, he's actually very passionate about cooking, and he started a smart oven. The original concept was for young Chinese people who love home-cooked food, but basically have no idea how to cook, which is probably most young Chinese people who live in cities these days. So he spent several years developing the prototype for this oven, which if you scan a barcode on certain food packages, will already preset the oven, can take food from frozen to perfectly cooked without any issue. It has a lot of things in it. It is completely connected to the web, which opens a million possibilities for this oven, which that could be a whole other podcast, but regardless. And we were really at the point where he was starting to get to the point where he had a final product that we could scale. And then COVID hit earlier this year. And I think ovens weren't exactly the first thing on people's minds, but he had already started talking to some aviation companies about using this oven for other purposes like airplanes. Imagine in a galley that food could come out more perfectly cooked than it is amazingly cooked on airplanes today, with a much smarter oven and food that's packaged in a different way. And then he was also talking to nursing homes about this, so that they could do centralized cooking, but also good food and reheating in a smart way that's efficient and doesn't take a lot of of space and can always be updated on a regular basis and with menus and various things. So it was already going down to sort of expanding from beyond this countertop and Chinese kitchens to some other paths in the B2B world, which I think is this first right thing for an entrepreneur to do, is not to be too married to their original idea. To say, are there other places that my product or service has application, and to dabble a little bit in it to see if maybe the biggest opportunity isn't the one you saw first, but the one you saw second or third. So that's sort of the first lesson. Then COVID hit this year, and in the midst of all this oven development, he has a few software engineers that work for him, and of course they also do development of the hardware themselves as well in a manufacturing facility in the south of China. And they saw an opportunity to, could they very quickly pivot what they know and understand about uploading data to the cloud with building very simple hardware. And so they actually reached out to Andrew Cuomo in New York City, and I don't actually know where it stands, but when they were last talking about it, he was able to come up with very quickly, within a few weeks, a mock-up of a card swipe on a wall in a school where a teacher, any teacher in the school, any student in the school, anyone in administration, anyone that's involved in the school with an ID for the school can tap the card swipe on the wall. A camera, which is above the card swipe, a camera takes a photo and also takes your temperature and uploads real-time live the name of the school, the name of the student, and their body temperature. So at any given moment in time, the governor of the state of New York could feasibly see every day after a certain time of day, if everyone's checked in, the temperatures if anyone has a fever or is at risk of COVID in any single school, in any single classroom, with any single teacher, anywhere in the entire state. So he was able to come with that incredibly quickly. So that's the kind of thing where I think you start to understand that when you're an inventor and you've built something, there are components that are modularized that you can repurpose for other things. And I think that's also a very clever way for the future of innovation, to really consider what are all the assets I have at my disposal, and is the combination that I put them in together first the best combination for what I care about to sell and for what the world needs or cares about to buy.
I just love that story. Thank you so much, Annabelle. I just love talking to you. So we talked about the future of language learning, new technologies that are coming up, startups, and how to face all this challenge that we all do to chase money, right? To get funded or to get new revenue coming there. And also about, creating new products and how to face the new realities that are just all of a sudden changing our lives. A lot of rich content. Thank you so much for that. Annabelle, it was such a pleasure to have you on the show. Do you have any final words for our listeners?
I would just say that I'm really optimistic about the future of education and technology. And some people are not big fans of technology in the education space, but it has so many uses. And the other thing I would say is all businesses could benefit from is really bridging generational gaps. We didn't talk too much about it today, but I think it's one of the most important things. Some of us older generation, I'm Gen X, but I'm starting to feel like one of the oldest generations. We and boomers, we have an obligation to support, millennials and younger generations, to give them the knowledge and understanding we have and let them take it to a whole new level. I'm really inspired by younger people in their 20s and 30s who have a much more optimistic, yet altruistic at the same time, way of seeing the world. And I think if we provide the support and tools for them to see some of their visions come to fruition, I think this will be a better world. And I think because millennials seem sometimes so different from a value standpoint and from an upbringing standpoint, we sometimes separate ourselves from different generations, and it's not on purpose, but it's a huge opportunity and something I think that will make technology better, businesses better, and the future better, and make us more informed leaders, make us more informed businesses, more informed governments. So that's just a good thing. That's the last thing I would leave us with. And here's to the great future we have ahead of us.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.